So how do we get information to store, or do we store information in our long-term memory? All right. One of the most, and you'll take a look at the model that I sent in the PowerPoint. Okay. One of the most common ways in which students will process information and put it in their long-term memory, rehearsal, right? We oftentimes use rehearsal. We repeat information over verbatim, over and over again. Helps us to get information, helps information get to short-term memory, and then we read it off a table, off of a list, okay? And it can help us get that information into our long-term memory. But typically with rehearsal, we run into some problems. What do you think those problems are? The problems that we run into with rehearsal as a primary strategy is there's typically not very many connections being made, which then, with lack of connections, makes it difficult to retrieve the information, right? Think about how the brain works. The more connections we have, the more associations we have, the easier it is to access that information or retrieve that information later. But when we tend to use rehearsal or memorization again and again and again, rote memorization, just to do that, what happens is sometimes it's very effective, and especially at the young ages, we find a lot of kids use rehearsal as their primary means when they're young. But when they're older and they still use that strategy, think about those biology tests that you had in high school. You got a list of vocabulary words. You memorized meiosis, mitosis, RNA, DNA, transcription. You remember all that stuff. You take the test. 2 weeks later, what happens? Can't remember any of it, right? You just memorized it just to get into your long-term memory, etc. Now, what's interesting about that is some people will have an argument because they misunderstand exactly how this model works. Okay, they use memorization. They study the night before, cram a bunch of stuff in, go the next morning, take the test, do well. 2 weeks later, forget it. Then I ask them, hey, did that stuff get into your long-term memory? And a lot of people were like, well, probably not because I couldn't remember it after 2 weeks. Aha, keep in mind, what is long-term memory? What is working memory? Were you able to hold on to stuff beyond 30 seconds? Were you able to remember, wait, you study the night before, cram it all in, wait 8 hours, go and take the test the next day? You know what? It did get to your long-term memory. You just didn't store it very effectively. It wasn't stored into your long-term memory very effectively. So when you went to retrieve it later, it was difficult. But you did hold that information for more than 30 seconds, so it did get to your long-term memory, just not very effectively. So rehearsal is commonly used by a lot of younger kids, hopefully less used by older kids, but it can get information to our long-term memory. But generally, it's not a strategy we advocate for in our classrooms because we fail to make a lot of connections with the material. What we prefer to do is we want students to learn things and process things in their long-term memory in a meaningful way, a meaningful learning experience, making connections between new information and prior knowledge. Now, if you think about that, we've talked about it before when we talked about Piaget or Vygotsky, right, or even social cognitive theory. We talked about how the previous experiences are important for future learning, that constructive nature of learning, right? Building on prior knowledge. We always have to keep in mind that a child's learning, a student's learning, is often, if not always, based on what they already know. So the more stuff that they have content-wise before they come into your class, when you start helping make them connections, then the learning becomes much more meaningful. Helps them to learn what to direct their attention to. It allows them to engage in meaningful learning because they're making connections with what they have already previously stored. If you think about long-term memory as a filing cabinet, and each time that we're storing new information, we're making new folders, new connections, etc. All right. What we find is, as a teacher, is we're trying to engage them in meaningful learning. We're trying to help them organize that information in such a way that will then later on allow them to make connections with the material and hopefully be able to expand on it, to expound on it. Okay. Now, what's interesting about it is, when you think about Piaget, Vygotsky, or meaningful learning experiences, you have to keep in mind, whilst it is definitely to our benefit as teachers and as students, that sometimes previously learned information can actually work against us, all right? Prior knowledge can influence our learning in an ineffective manner when we have things that we've learned in an inefficient manner or maybe misconceptions. You think about this. Think about how your understanding of the cycle of, you think about the phases of the moon. Ask a young child, how does it work? And what you'll find a lot of times with young kids is they have this conception, this schema in their head of the sun's on one side and the moon's on the other side of the earth. When it's day, the sun's out. When it's nighttime, the moon's out, right? So what we find is that as the earth rotates and is spinning, when it's daytime, the sun pops out, and then as it turns around, then suddenly moon comes out, et cetera, et cetera. That's their conception. That's how they see things. But what we realize is that they misunderstand how that actually works. Because one morning they come out and they look up in the sun, up in the sky, and they see the sun, and then off to the side they see the moon. They're like, how the heck did that happen? Okay, what did we realize? What did we learn? We learned that the moon and the sun are not necessarily 180 degrees apart from each other. Well, when you start trying to explain certain things from a science standpoint, that misconception can really inhibit or influence how they learn. Nick, are you out there? Okay. So the idea is that misconceptions, previously learned information, normally oftentimes helps us, but when it comes to misinformation, to things that we didn't truly understand, and we start building on that. Remember, building a house, the most important part of building a house is the foundation. When the foundation is shaky or faulty, we start to realize, uh-oh, all the future learning being built on that rocky foundation can be difficult. Okay, so sometimes we don't have the prior knowledge, and we might use tricks to help us remember things. Excuse me, Jack. We use tricks or aids to help us remember information that's typically referred to as mnemonics. And mnemonics are that trick or that idea of helping us remember information, typically information that is very lower level, superficial knowledge, that things like Roy G. Biv, what is that? Or face, or Ethan, will you plug in my computer here, please? I'm still filming. Go around the other way. There's another charger right there. When you hear the word Holmes, when you hear Roy D. Biv, when you hear those are just acronyms, devices to help you remember the colors of the rainbow. Or Holmes, okay, is the lakes, the Great Lakes, right? Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior. Or you think about face, you think about notes on a scale. The idea is using mnemonic devices is just a trick to help us to remember a lot of factual information, okay? But the thing is that what you do with that information is oftentimes very limited to superficial knowledge, declarative knowledge, etc. And so we try to use them as a tool, but we don't rely on them for much of our higher order thinking, problem solving stuff. The idea is we like to help create a meaningful learning set when teaching, so that way the students develop a positive attitude, so that they connect the new information with old information and how it's going to be used going forward. Okay, so now besides rehearsal, which is a strategy that can help get information long-term memory, we are much more inclined to focus on things that are going to be learned in a meaningful way. One of the things that we find that is very helpful to us as teachers to help our students is organization, the organizational structure of a lesson. Now, I have a couple of little slides in the PowerPoint that if you work through will show you just exactly how organization is so important in learning information. All right. Now, children tend to show an increasing tendency to be able to chunk and organize information. But how do we help students in this process? Well, oftentimes we have to provide structure. Students, you think about this, young kids. So I say I have some young kids come over. I need them to help clean my garage. I've got a 3-car garage. I need to help do that. Now, what a lot of times you see young kids would do in this situation is they take all the stuff out of the garage. All right, they got all the stuff out, they broom it, they brush it all down, and then they go and put the stuff back in. How do they put that stuff back in? They put it right back where it was, okay? Now, as you get older, you start to realize that's not a very efficient, that's not a very effective way. So what we do is we take the stuff out, we clean the garage, but when we put it back in, we put it back in. Lawn area stuff here, car stuff here, holiday stuff here. We organize things, and it helps us. We see the numerous different sets of belongings or things that were in the garage, and they are grouped by category. And it's going to be a lot easier to remember where stuff is, to grab stuff if we put them away in an appropriate place. That's because we see that as adults. Young kids don't. Take it out, clean it, put it all back in. So as teachers in the classroom, it's the same thing. Young kids have a tendency not to be able to organize the information as meaningful, as organized, and so as a teachers, we help with that structure. Okay, we fit the material to the structures of our students' mind. As kids are younger, much more structure. As they get older, they can develop more autonomy and have their own structure. And this method, like I said, the organization is much more important for younger kids, but it's important for all of us. We've all had a professor or a teacher that when they're taking notes or when they're teaching, if they from time to time say, "Oh, I forgot this. Oh, put this here." Now, when I'm taking notes, it drives me crazy because I like to have things in a very linear way, linear fashion. I like to have my notes make sense, be very clear. I can read them and understand them at a later date. But when I start to have to write things in sideways, out in the margins, it just screws up my notes and drives me crazy, okay? Teacher lacks organization. The lesson comes across as unorganized, which then makes it difficult to remember at a later date, okay? Very constructivist in nature. Besides organization, we also realize the importance of elaboration. What does it mean to elaborate on something? Well, elaboration is adding additional ideas to the new information based on what one already knows. Now, this method is most often used by better and by older students. Why? Well, let's go back to the filing cabinet example. If every time you learn something new, you put a file in your filing cabinet, what we'll call the brain. When you're really young, how many files do you have in your filing cabinet? As you get older, you have more and more and more filing cabinets. You learn something new. If you already have a file, you put it into that file. If you don't have a file, you create a new one. But the idea is, as you get older, you have many more files. So when I ask you to elaborate on something, you pull that file out from your memory. You pull it out of the filing cabinet. You open it up, and you got a bunch of stuff already there. Lots of connections. You can elaborate on something. When I ask my kids, like when I'm teaching something to them or helping them understand something, I ask them to elaborate. When they're really young, they tend to just regurgitate the definition over and over again. When I ask them to expand or to elaborate, they get frustrated because they can't, because they don't have the prior knowledge. They don't have the previous schemes. Without those previous schemes, they can't expand. So what we find is that people are going to elaborate on the same things in different manners because they have different folders in their filing cabinet. They have different experiences, and based on those experiences, they're going to elaborate differently. Okay? So elaboration can lead to distorted or erroneous informations, misconceptions. Students have the right foundation, they elaborate, fine. Wrong foundation, they struggle. All right? So as a teacher, what we want to do is we want students to elaborate as much as possible, but we have to make sure that they have the previous knowledge or skills in place so that when they elaborate effectively and they can remember it better.